On a warm summer evening, in a quiet suburban neighborhood that prided itself on safety, something truly terrifying occurred. What began as a casual stroll ended in a scene of unimaginable horror. A body, discovered deep in the bushes, bore harrowing evidence of a savage, prolonged attack. Bruises, lacerations, and signs of a desperate struggle painted a picture of violence so brutal it left the community in shock. Forensic experts later concluded that death had not come swiftly but painfully in a storm of rage and cruelty. What could drive someone to such inhumanity? Investigators asked this question repeatedly as they painstakingly pieced together a timeline of faint, ominous clues. This wasn't just a murder case. It was a tragedy that left a permanent scar on the town's sense of security. At approximately 8:20 p.m., a jogging couple encountered Dog on a secluded trail. The dog was alone, her leash dragging behind her, and she seemed deeply agitated. Dog's erratic movements, darting back and forth, appeared desperate, as if she were urging them to follow. Unease crept over the couple as they decided to trail the frantic animal. Dog led them into a shadowy thicket. What lay before them would become a nightmare etched into their minds. In a blood-soaked ravine was the lifeless form of a young woman. Shaken to their core, the couple immediately contacted the authorities. The area quickly swarmed with law enforcement, their flashlights casting unsettling shadows on the grim scene. By the time April's family arrived, the site had been cordoned off, police scouring every inch for signs of what had occurred. April Millsap was born on January 18, 1998, in the small town of Armada, Michigan, USA. From a young age, April was known for her cheerful personality and kind heart, which made her a beloved member of her community. She grew up in a loving family and shared a close bond with her mother, Jennifer Millsap, who described her as a bright and thoughtful child. When she was 6 years old, her parents divorced, leading her father to enter into a relationship with a man named David. April and her stepfather quickly developed a warm and harmonious relationship, providing her with an extended family that enriched her life. By the age of 16, April had already cultivated a sense of independence, often walking her dog Penny alone. While she cherished her time with friends, she remained deeply connected to her family, balancing her social life with familial bonds. April was also in a romantic relationship with Austin, a year her senior, whom she had met at school. Their relationship had blossomed over the past year, adding another layer of happiness to her life. In 2014, Armada was a tight-knit community with a population of approximately 1,700 residents. Known for its safety and ideal environment for families, everyone in the town knew each other by name and face. The place turned out to be safe, ideal for a family to live and raise children. However, as life experience shows, such circumstances make places like this very attractive to criminals. Here, they strike rarely, but it causes real panic. July 24, 2014, marked a day when summer vacation was in full bloom. On this particular day, April Millsap had no grand plans or special gatherings on her agenda. Instead, she opted to relish a leisurely day at home. She slept in until noon, savoring the unhurried pace that summer afforded her, and spent the afternoon immersed in her computer activities. She chatted with friends, scrolled through various websites, and indulged in her favorite video games. It was a day that seemed as ordinary as any other, with nothing out of the ordinary on the horizon. As the evening approached, around 6 p.m., April decided it was time for her daily walk with Penny. Penny, her loyal and spirited canine companion, was a constant source of joy in her life. These walks were more than just routine. They were cherished moments that allowed April to connect with nature, clear her mind, and appreciate the simple beauty of Armada. She chose one of her usual paths, a well-trodden trail that offered both familiarity and comfort. Typically, these walks lasted about an hour, and Jennifer had every reason to feel secure, knowing April's consistent schedule. However, as time passed without April's return, Jennifer began to feel a growing sense of unease. By 7:30 p.m., when April had yet to come back home, Jennifer's concern deepened. She attempted to reach her daughter's phone, but the calls were met with silence, redirecting straight to voicemail. Frustrated and worried, Jennifer sent several text messages but received no response. The creeping anxiety intensified, leaving her increasingly troubled. By 8 p.m., Jennifer was beginning to panic. She called April's boyfriend, Austin, hoping that perhaps they had met up spontaneously. To her dismay, Austin said he hadn't seen April all day. They had only exchanged messages online earlier. Alarmed by Jennifer's tone, Austin offered to help and arrived at the Millsap residence shortly after, accompanied by a friend. When Austin mentioned a strange message he had received from April, Jennifer's anxiety turned to outright fear. Austin revealed that at 6:28 p.m., just 40 minutes after April had left for her walk, she had sent him a chilling message. "Someone tried to kidnap me." He explained that he hadn't seen the message immediately, claiming it was delayed due to poor network coverage. Once he saw it, he hurried over to look for her, but his search had yielded no results. Jennifer immediately called her husband, David, who was at work. The urgency in her voice spurred him into action. He rushed home to join the search. Together, David, Jennifer, Austin, and his friend fanned out across the neighborhood, retracing the routes April often took. They knew the trails she loved, the quiet paths where she found solace. Jennifer also called the police, pleading for their assistance. The authorities, though limited in resources, joined the search with a sense of urgency. Armada was a small, tight-knit community where violent crimes were almost unheard of. The disappearance of a teenager under such mysterious circumstances was deeply unsettling. Around 8:20 p.m., a couple jogging on one of the trails encountered Penny. The dog was alone, her leash trailing behind her. Penny was frantic, running back and forth as if trying to lead them somewhere. Concerned, the couple followed the dog. Penny darted into a dense thicket, and what they discovered next would haunt them forever. Lying in a bloody ravine, partially hidden by the undergrowth, was the lifeless body of a woman. The sight was devastating. The woman's clothing was disheveled, and the area around her was stained with blood. The couple immediately contacted the authorities. By the time April's family arrived, the scene was already cordoned off, and law enforcement officers were combing through the area for clues. Jennifer and David's worst fears were confirmed when they identified the body as their daughter's. The grief was overwhelming. The local law enforcement agencies swiftly recognized that they were ill-prepared to handle a case of such magnitude. Armada, a small town with a population of merely 1,700 residents, was renowned for its peacefulness, where criminal activities rarely escalated beyond minor thefts. The town's modest police force, consisting of just 2 officers, lacked both the experience and the resources necessary to investigate a violent homicide. Acknowledging the intricate nature of the situation, the sheriff promptly sought assistance from county authorities and state investigators. Additionally, the FBI was enlisted to provide specialized expertise and advanced technological support. The ensuing investigation uncovered that April had been subjected to a brutal attack. Evidence at the scene suggested a struggle. April had fiercely resisted her assailant. Nevertheless, the sheer brutality of the crime was beyond anything the investigators had anticipated. Forensic specialists began the meticulous collection of evidence, while detectives dedicated themselves to reconstructing the sequence of events leading up to April's tragic death. The discovery of her lifeless body sent shockwaves through the community, obliterating the long-held sense of security that Armada's residents had cherished. In a more detailed examination of the crime scene, investigators found April at the base of a ravine, lying on her back amidst thick, overgrown vegetation. Her shoes had been forcibly removed and discarded several meters away from her body, a grim indication that her final moments were filled with fear and violence. Both her clothing and underwear were pulled down, initially suggesting a potential sexual motive behind the crime. However, comprehensive forensic analysis determined that April had not been sexually assaulted. This revelation led detectives to theorize that the perpetrator might have intended to commit such an act, but was thwarted by April's fierce resistance, or perhaps an unforeseen interruption, such as the presence of her dog or a bystander. Regardless of the motive, the crime was shockingly violent. April exhibited numerous bruises across her body, with significant defensive wounds on her arms and hands, highlighting her courageous attempts to protect herself. Her face was severely disfigured, with investigators describing it as crushed. The coroner documented at least 48 distinct injuries, primarily concentrated on her face and neck. Her body was covered in clotted blood, providing stark evidence of the prolonged and savage nature of the assault. In a particularly chilling finding, the coroner detected traces of neck compression. However, these did not align with the typical patterns of strangulation by hand or with an external object. Further analysis revealed unusual impressions on her face and neck, which were identified as shoe tread patterns. The forensic conclusion was horrifying. April had been trampled to death. Her attacker had stomped on her with the sole of a large sneaker, employing it as a weapon. The brutality was appalling, with the coroner estimating that the assault lasted over 10 minutes. April endured agonizing pain in her final moments. Based on the characteristics of the tread marks, detectives inferred that the perpetrator was likely a tall, physically imposing man. However, the extreme violence suggested something more sinister, perhaps driven by rage or cold-blooded cruelty that surpassed the typical motives seen in random acts of violence. April's face was so severely damaged that identifying her by physical features was impossible. This realization left her loved ones, especially her mother, Jennifer, devastated and engulfed in immeasurable grief. The investigation commenced promptly, focusing initially on those closest to April. Her parents, stepfather, boyfriend Austin, and even Austin's friend was brought in for questioning at the police station. Detectives aimed to construct a detailed timeline of events and identify any possible motives. Both April's biological father and her stepfather were swiftly eliminated as suspects. However, suspicion soon intensified around her boyfriend, Austin. Detectives became increasingly wary when Austin described his recent relationship with April as strained. He admitted that they had been arguing frequently, and their relationship was nearing a breaking point. Additionally, Austin disclosed that they had quarreled shortly before April's murder. While Austin's candor might have been an attempt to demonstrate his openness, it inadvertently painted him as a person with a potential motive. The discovery of a chilling message from April to Austin heightened the scrutiny on him. April had sent Austin a text shortly before her death saying, "Someone tried to kidnap me." Shockingly, Austin admitted that he had not immediately reported the message to anyone, nor had he contacted the police. Instead, he claimed that he only went out to search for her himself after finally seeing the message. His explanation for the delay was that the message had arrived late due to poor network connectivity. To detectives, Austin's actions seemed unusually indifferent. His response to such a grave message appeared sluggish and devoid of urgency. When asked why he hadn't reacted immediately, Austin offered a revealing explanation. He had assumed the message was an attempt by April to manipulate him emotionally. He believed she was trying to provoke concern and re-establish communication after their argument. This reasoning, while perhaps understandable in the context of a quarrel, struck investigators as cold and dismissive, given the situation's gravity. When pressed further about their quarrel, Austin struggled to provide specifics. He claimed that April's behavior had been inexplicable and that the argument arose out of the blue. He deflected blame, suggesting that April was the one responsible for their recent tensions. This, combined with his apparent apathy toward her distress call, reinforced detectives' doubts about him. In cases of violent crimes, it is frequently observed that partners or close acquaintances of the victim are statistically the most probable perpetrators. This understanding guided the investigators in their initial assessment of April's tragic death. Austin's behavior, coupled with his close proximity to April, naturally placed him under intense scrutiny. Law enforcement authorities made the decision to detain him for further interrogation, aiming to thoroughly examine his activities on the day April disappeared. Their objective was to construct a clear timeline and verify his alibi to determine if he had any involvement in the crime. Austin provided a detailed account of his whereabouts on the afternoon of April's disappearance. He stated that at approximately 4 p.m., he had met with a friend to assist in bringing a television into his home. After completing this task, they decided to grab a snack and proceeded to the nearest fast food cafe. This timeline of events appeared routine and uneventful, aligning with what one might expect on a typical day. To substantiate his claims, investigators meticulously reviewed the CCTV footage from the cafe. The footage confirmed Austin's presence at the establishment around 6:30 p.m., just minutes after April had sent the ominous message regarding an attempted kidnapping. This verification provided concrete evidence that Austin could not have been involved in April's murder, as his location was firmly established during the critical time frame. Despite the initial suspicions, the detectives were compelled to explore alternative avenues. However, certain aspects of Austin's behavior remained perplexing. His dismissive response to April's distressing text message and his apparent lack of urgency in comprehending the severity of the situation raised lingering questions. These inconsistencies highlighted the intricate and often convoluted nature of human relationships, which can obscure the path to uncovering the truth in complex criminal investigations. As the investigation advanced, it became increasingly apparent that April's death was not a straightforward case of passion-driven violence or a random act of brutality. This realization reinvigorated the investigative team, who committed themselves to exhaust every possible lead in their relentless pursuit of justice for April Millsap. With Austin definitively cleared of any involvement, the investigators redirected their focus to other potential leads. The next critical step was to locate and analyze April's mobile phone, which was believed to hold essential information that could unravel the mystery of her murder. The absence of her phone at the crime scene was particularly concerning, leading detectives to theorize that the perpetrator had deliberately taken it, likely disabling it to prevent any tracking and subsequently discarding it to eliminate evidence. The quest to find April's phone and gather additional evidence became a top priority for the investigative team. Forensic experts conducted exhaustive searches along the trails that April frequented, meticulously combing through areas where she might have wandered during her final moments. Specialized search units, including teams with trained dogs, were deployed to scour the dense vegetation and rugged terrain surrounding the ravine. The involvement of the FBI added a layer of expertise and advanced technological resources to the efforts, significantly enhancing the search operations. The search extended well into the following day, testing the endurance and determination of the investigators and volunteers alike. Just when hope seemed to wane, a breakthrough occurred. Approximately a kilometer from the original crime scene, searchers discovered April's mobile phone. The device was promptly sent to a forensic laboratory for detailed analysis, marking a pivotal moment in the investigation. The forensic examination of the phone yielded critical information that shed new light on the case. Investigators uncovered that April had been in regular contact with a school acquaintance named Roger. Roger, known for his abrasive personality and frequent run-ins, initially emerged as a potential suspect. However, further investigation revealed that Roger had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, corroborated by multiple reliable sources, thereby eliminating him from suspicion. As detectives continued to piece together the timeline and interview witnesses, a new lead surfaced. Several residents reported seeing a man on a motorcycle interacting with April shortly before her disappearance. Witnesses described the man as significantly older than April, pushing a blue and white motorcycle while walking alongside her. They appeared to be engaged in conversation, and at the time, his demeanor did not raise any immediate red flags. In fact, some witnesses even mistook him for April's father due to his calm and composed behavior. However, in the context of April's disappearance, the investigators began to question his intentions, considering the possibility that he might have had a role in the tragic event. The description of the motorcycle was specific and uncommon, a rare blue and white model. This unique feature allowed investigators to focus their efforts on tracking down the vehicle. 3 days after April's murder, on April 27, 2014, the motorcycle was located parked in the driveway of a local residence. The homeowner told police that the motorcycle did not belong to them. It was owned by a 32-year-old friend, James Vancalis, who lived in a neighboring town about 30 kilometers away from Armada. Investigators wasted no time in contacting James Vancalis. From the outset, James appeared cooperative and willing to answer the detectives' questions. He stated that on the day of April's murder, he had been visiting a friend in Armada and claimed to have spent the afternoon and evening there. His alibi was corroborated by his friend, but detectives remained skeptical. They knew the reliability of an alibi provided by a close associate could be compromised by loyalty or collusion. Inconsistencies in James's account began to emerge during further questioning. When asked about the shoes he wore on the day of the murder, James produced a pair of white sneakers. There were no bloodstains on the sneakers James Vancalis provided to detectives. Also, forensic analysis revealed that the tread pattern on the sneakers did not match the distinctive marks left on April's body. But the size was identical. This discrepancy immediately raised suspicions that these were not the sneakers he had been wearing on the day of April Millsap's murder. Detectives decided to delve deeper into James's history to determine whether he could be excluded from the list of potential suspects. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. James had a series of convictions, although none were for violent crimes. His criminal record included charges for breaking and entering in 2005 and 2006, as well as for non-payment of alimony. While these offenses suggested a disregard for the law, they did not align with the profile of a brutal murderer. However, when investigators broadened their inquiry to include his family background, they found something far more alarming. James's father, James Vancalis Sr., was a registered sex offender with a documented history of sexual assaults. During the period in question, both father and son lived in the same family house. This revelation raised the possibility that the elder Vancalis could also have been involved in criminal activities, or at the very least, contributed to a deeply troubled environment. The elder Vancalis had previously been accused of sexually harassing a minor, and his criminal record reflected a pattern of predatory behavior. Initially, investigators considered the possibility that both father and son could have been involved in criminal episodes. However, witness accounts from the day of April's murder pointed clearly to James Jr. Witnesses described the suspect as a middle-aged man who matched James Jr.'s description, making him the primary focus of the investigation. Searches conducted at the Vancalis residence uncovered additional incriminating evidence. Police found a substantial quantity of illegal plants growing on their property. The scale of the operation was significant enough to warrant drug distribution charges, which led to the arrest of both James and his father. This move served a dual purpose. It removed them as potential flight risks and gave authorities more time to investigate the murder without interference. Despite the thorough search of the house, police were unable to find the sneakers that matched the tread marks on April's body. Numerous DNA analyses were conducted on James's clothing and personal items, but no matches with April's DNA were found. Forensic experts who examined James's motorcycle, however, made a critical observation. It had been meticulously cleaned with strong disinfectants shortly before being taken into custody. This level of cleanliness was unusual and suggested a deliberate attempt to remove evidence. The lack of any residual traces further confirmed that James had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. The detective's suspicions were bolstered when James's girlfriend, Crystal, contacted the police. Crystal provided chilling insights into James's behavior on the day of April's murder. She recalled returning home to find him obsessively cleaning his shoes, motorcycle, and helmet. The intensity of his efforts struck her as unusual, and the strong cleaning agents he used only deepened her concerns. Crystal also revealed that James had admitted to her that he was cleaning because he had gotten engine oil on his belongings while repairing his motorcycle, a claim she did not believe. Crystal's testimony included a key piece of evidence. She described the sneakers James had been wearing on the day of the murder. They were his favorite black and white sneakers, a pair she had seen him wear frequently. These shoes, however, did not match the ones he handed over to detectives during his initial questioning. Crystal also noted that after that night, she never saw those sneakers again. She suspected that James had disposed of them, realizing that they might link him to the crime. Crystal went on to detail her tumultuous relationship with James. She described him as cruel and controlling, with a violent temper that left her feeling like a prisoner in her own home. He restricted her movements, forbidding her from leaving the house without his accompaniment. She admitted that she had been afraid of him for a long time, fearing for her life if she ever defied him. Now, with James and his father detained, Crystal felt safe enough to speak candidly about her experiences. The police knew they needed to prove conclusively that James had been wearing the sneakers Crystal described. Their breakthrough came when they discovered photos on James's social media profiles. In several pictures, James could be seen wearing black and white sneakers identical to the ones Crystal had mentioned. While the original pair was no longer in his possession, detectives purchased an identical pair of sneakers from the same brand and compared the tread pattern to the marks found on April's body. The forensic analysis was definitive. The tread pattern of the replica sneakers matched the impressions left on April's body with absolute precision. This finding confirmed that the original pair of sneakers, James's favorite, had been used during the murder. April Millsap had been trampled to death by someone wearing those shoes, and all evidence pointed to James Vancalis as the perpetrator. The investigation took a darker turn as forensic experts revisited the helmet James had cleaned so thoroughly. The marks on April's head bore a striking resemblance to the contours of the helmet. It became increasingly clear that James had used the helmet as a weapon during the attack. This finding, combined with the tread marks and the circumstantial evidence, left no doubt in the minds of investigators. The case against James Vancalis was growing stronger. but it was also becoming a chilling reminder of the lengths to which he had gone to evade detection. His meticulous efforts to erase evidence, combined with his violent and controlling tendencies, painted the picture of a cold and calculating individual. The trail of evidence, painstakingly pieced together by detectives, was now leading inexorably toward justice for April Millsap. During a detailed examination of James Vancalis's computer, investigators uncovered evidence that confirmed their suspicions. His online activity revealed a disturbing interest in much younger women, with searches and website visits that left no doubt about his predatory tendencies. This revelation painted a clearer picture of his potential motive and the dark undercurrents of his personality. Even more crucial was the information obtained from April Millsap's mobile phone, analyzed in an FBI laboratory. Among the data recovered was a fitness app that April used regularly. This app recorded various parameters such as speed, steps, and heart rate. The data provided a chilling timeline of her final moments. Shortly after April sent the alarming message to her boyfriend Austin about an attempted kidnapping, her recorded speed increased dramatically. It was as if she had suddenly started running, likely trying to escape from someone pursuing her. Investigators pieced together the likely scenario. James Vancalis had driven up to April on his motorcycle, possibly offering her something or attempting to engage her in conversation. Sensing danger, April had texted Austin before attempting to flee. Within minutes, the fitness app recorded chaotic, erratic movements that reflected a desperate struggle. This activity continued for 10 to 15 harrowing minutes, capturing the heartbreaking reality of a woman fighting for her life. Tragically, the data also marked the moment when her struggle ended. Not long after, the app recorded another significant detail. The phone began moving at a steady speed of approximately 60 kilometers per hour, consistent with someone riding a motorcycle. This speed was maintained until the phone was discarded roughly a kilometer away from the scene of the attack. This action, investigators believed, was James's attempt to dispose of evidence while fleeing the area. Several surveillance cameras along the biker's route provided further incriminating evidence. The footage clearly showed James Vancalis on his motorcycle, and his movements aligned with the timeline established by the fitness app. Geolocation data from his mobile phone also placed him near the crime scene during the critical time frame, contradicting his earlier claim that he had been at a friend's house. With this evidence, investigators were confident they had identified April's killer. Despite the mounting case against him, there was a critical problem: the absence of direct evidence. Investigators lacked DNA linking James to the crime, a fact that his defense team would undoubtedly exploit. Forensic experts had scoured his belongings, including his motorcycle, helmet, and clothing, but found no traces of April's blood or DNA. The thorough cleaning of his items had effectively erased any physical evidence, underscoring James's calculated efforts to cover his tracks. Given these challenges, the prosecutor's office faced a difficult decision. Despite the indirect nature of the evidence, it was substantial and damning. The cumulative weight of the surveillance footage, geolocation data, fitness app records, and James's known predatory behavior painted a compelling picture. In October 2014, 3 months after April's murder, James Vancalis was formally charged. The trial was set for early 2016. The prosecution argued that James's actions were driven by a twisted motive. He had reportedly spent years searching the internet for methods of seduction, fixating on ways to attract much younger women. These searches revealed a man obsessed with his desires, unable to accept rejection. Prosecutors contended that April had rebuffed his advances, triggering a violent, rage-fueled attack. The evidence suggested that he had trailed April on his motorcycle, confronted her, and ultimately unleashed a brutal assault when she resisted. The defense, as expected, centered their argument on the lack of direct evidence. They pointed out that no DNA or physical traces connected James to April's murder. His lawyer argued that the prosecution's case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence, which, while compelling, could not irrefutably prove his guilt. The defense also highlighted James's relatively clean criminal record, emphasizing that he had never been convicted of a violent crime. Despite these efforts, the jury was unconvinced by the defense's arguments. The sheer volume of evidence against James, combined with the harrowing details of April's final moments, left little doubt in their minds. His actions on the day of the murder, his attempts to erase evidence, and his disturbing online activity painted a damning portrait of his culpability. Throughout the trial, James maintained his innocence, showing no remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. His lack of contrition only deepened the outrage among April's family and the community. The aftermath of the trial brought a mix of emotions to April's family and community. While justice had been served, it could not undo the tragedy of her loss. To honor her memory, a memorial garden was established near the site where her life was cruelly taken. At its center stood a small statue of her beloved dog, Penny, who had led strangers to the place where April was found. The garden became a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. April Millsap's story remains a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the safest of places. Her tragic death underscored the need for communities to stay vigilant and proactive in addressing threats, as well as the importance of fostering an environment where victims feel empowered to seek help. Her legacy lives on, not only in the memorial garden, but also in the hearts of those who continue to fight for justice in her name. After deliberating for several hours, the jury unanimously found him guilty of attempted kidnapping, rape, and premeditated murder. As a result, James Vancalis was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. April Millsap's mother spoke at length during the sentencing. The woman was satisfied with the court's decision and the fact that the criminal would never be released. She was shocked that a child could die at the hands of an adult man just because he was refused. Night, when Raven returned home, he had no idea that he was about to stumble upon a scene so gruesome and shocking that it would change the course of his life forever. The moment he stepped through the door, the familiar comfort of his home vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. On the cold floor lay Janet's lifeless body. At first, Raven's mind struggled to make sense of it. His first thought was that she had been shot, perhaps a break-in gone terribly wrong. But as paramedics arrived, the grim truth became clear. This was no random act of violence. It was something far more sinister, calculated, and deeply disturbing. This documentary will focus on Janet Abaroa, was born on June 19, 1979, in a quiet and picturesque small town in Virginia. She was the seventh of 10 children in a large and close-knit family that placed deep importance on faith, values, and togetherness. From childhood, Janet had an innate love for children, often taking on the role of caretaker for her younger siblings. She harbored dreams of one day having a big family of her own, where she could provide the same warmth and love that she had experienced in her upbringing. Alongside her nurturing nature, Janet was also highly disciplined and excelled academically. Schoolwork came easily to her, and she managed to balance her studies with an active participation in sports. As she progressed to high school and later to college, she continued to pursue her passion for sports, playing for local teams and eventually joining the women's soccer team at the University of Southern Virginia. It was during one of her college matches in 1998 that Janet met Raven Abaroa, a talented soccer player who played for the Southern Virginia University men's soccer team. The two were immediately drawn to each other, and what started as a casual friendship soon blossomed into a deep and passionate romance. Their relationship flourished for 2 years, and in that time, they grew inseparable. Finally, Raven, despite being a year younger than Janet, proposed to her, declaring his unwavering love and commitment. She happily accepted, and in August 2000, they were married in the Sacred Mormon Temple in Washington, D.C. A significant and deeply meaningful event for both of them and their families. Following their wedding, the couple eagerly embarked on their new journey together, setting their sights on building a stable and happy life. The first major step they took was seeking employment to ensure financial independence. They secured jobs as salespeople at a sporting goods store, which required them to relocate to Durham, North Carolina. Upon arrival, they rented a modest house in the suburbs, hoping to establish a solid foundation for their future. To the outside world, Janet and Raven appeared to be the picture-perfect couple. Young, ambitious, and deeply in love. Friends, neighbors, and even colleagues admired their relationship and often spoke of how they complemented each other. However, beneath the surface, cracks began to form in their seemingly ideal marriage. Not long after settling into their new life, Janet confided in close family members and friends that Raven was not the devoted husband he appeared to be. She discovered that he was unfaithful, engaging in extramarital affairs with multiple women. The betrayals were painful and humiliating, shattering her trust in him. On one occasion, he even left home for several days without any explanation, only to return as if nothing had happened. Amidst this turmoil, Janet discovered she was pregnant, a revelation that brought both joy and anxiety. While she had always dreamed of becoming a mother, the circumstances surrounding her marriage left her feeling conflicted and uncertain about the future. She feared raising a child alone, but was equally troubled by the prospect of staying with a man who continually betrayed her trust. During this challenging time, Janet found solace in the friendships she built within her neighborhood. She grew close to several women who became a support system for her, offering advice, encouragement, and companionship. These friends even confronted Raven, urging him to change his ways and remain faithful to his pregnant wife. Whether out of guilt or genuine intention, Raven promised to mend his ways and become a devoted husband and father. Janet, hoping for the best, allowed herself to believe that things would improve, especially with the impending arrival of their baby. On October 17, 2004, Janet gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, whom they named Caden. The moment she held her son in her arms, everything else faded into the background. Her primary focus became providing him with the best life possible. She devoted herself entirely to motherhood, showering Caden with love and care, determined to give him a stable upbringing. However, the joy of motherhood was overshadowed by the financial struggles the family faced. With Janet no longer working, their household depended solely on Raven's income from his job as a salesman, which was barely enough to cover their expenses. They quickly fell behind on rent, prompting their landlord to offer them a 3-month grace period out of sympathy for their situation. Despite this temporary relief, their financial troubles only worsened. In December 2004, just 2 months after Caden's birth, the situation took a drastic turn. During this period, their son Caden was merely 2 months old when tragedy struck once more. The child's father, Raven Abaroa, found himself in serious legal trouble. He was arrested for theft after being caught stealing merchandise from the very sporting goods store where he and his wife had been employed. Investigators discovered that he had stolen several high-end tracksuits and resold them online for quick cash. The total amount of damages resulting from his actions exceeded $10,000, leading to swift legal consequences. Unsurprisingly, he was immediately terminated from his position, and in the wake of this disgraceful scandal, Janet, unable to withstand the shame and humiliation of her husband's actions, also resigned from her job. Though the charges against him could have resulted in jail time, Raven managed to evade incarceration. Instead, he was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to pay $15,000 in restitution to the sporting goods store. This left both parents unemployed, financially destitute, and struggling to provide for their newborn child. With a criminal record now attached to his name, Raven found it nearly impossible to secure stable employment. To make ends meet, the couple resorted to part-time jobs and relied heavily on the support of family and friends who offered financial and emotional assistance. Despite the mounting stress and hardship, the young family fought to stay afloat, but their struggles would soon take a much darker and more sinister turn. On the evening of April 26, 2005, Janet picked up Caden from daycare as she did every day. She and her infant son returned home, where she began preparing dinner, settling into the routine of motherhood. Later that evening, Raven arrived home, sat down for dinner with his wife, and, after spending time with his family, announced that he was heading to Morrisville to participate in an indoor soccer game. At the time, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, upon returning home that night, Raven stumbled upon a gruesome and shocking scene that would alter the course of his life forever. The home, once a sanctuary, had become a nightmarish crime scene. Blood splattered the walls and floor, creating a horrifying tableau of violence. Janet's lifeless body lay sprawled in an unnatural position on the floor, a dark pool of blood surrounding her. Their infant son, Caden, lay unharmed in his crib, wailing helplessly in distress. Overcome with shock and horror, Raven frantically dialed 911. His voice panicked as he reported his wife's murder. He told the emergency operator that he had just returned home to find Janet covered in blood, seemingly attacked by an unknown assailant. Initially, he speculated that she had been shot, but when paramedics arrived, it became evident that she had been stabbed multiple times. The crime was brutal, precise, and deeply disturbing. Janet, a young mother with her whole life ahead of her, had died instantly from the fatal wounds inflicted upon her. Law enforcement officers were shaken by the sheer savagery of the crime. The immediate question that loomed over the investigation was, who could commit such a heinous act against a woman who had devoted her life to her family? Forensic experts meticulously combed through the crime scene, collecting critical evidence that might lead to the perpetrator. The victim's body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy was performed to determine the exact cause of death. The autopsy report revealed that Janet had sustained 3 deep stab wounds. One was found on her left arm, which forensic experts identified as a defensive wound, indicating that she had fought back against her attacker. The second wound was located in her chest, a lethal strike that contributed to her rapid demise. However, it was the third wound that sealed her fate. A deep stab wound to the neck severed a major artery, causing Janet to lose blood at an alarming rate. Within seconds, she had likely fallen unconscious, and within minutes, her life had ended. Adding to the tragedy, an autopsy confirmed that Janet was pregnant at the time of the murder. The loss of both mother and unborn child sent shockwaves through the community, amplifying the urgency of the investigation. Despite the calculated precision of the attack, forensic experts struggled to determine the exact sequence of the fatal blows. The body exhibited early signs of decomposition, but the low temperature inside the home had likely slowed the process, making it difficult to pinpoint the precise time of death. While forensic specialists worked to piece together the puzzle through physical evidence, detectives turned their attention to potential witnesses who might have seen or heard anything unusual that evening. Almost immediately, their focus shifted to the person who would naturally be considered a suspect, the husband of the deceased, Raven Abaroa. Given the nature of the crime and the history of turmoil in their marriage, he became a person of significant interest in the case. Raven was called in for questioning multiple times, and based on his statements, investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of events leading up to Janet's tragic death. According to his account, he had returned home around 8 p.m. that evening before leaving shortly after to attend his soccer game in Morrisville. He claimed that he did not return home until approximately 10:40 p.m. Upon entering the house, he allegedly called out to his wife, but when she did not respond, he proceeded upstairs. It was there, he insisted, that he discovered her lifeless body. Raven told detectives that Janet sometimes knelt in an unusual posture to relieve leg cramps. Janet was found kneeling with her head pressed against the floor, motionless and unresponsive. At first, Raven was unsure of what he was witnessing, but when he turned on the lights, he was confronted with a horrifying scene. In a state of panic, he quickly turned his wife onto her side and realized with a sinking feeling that she was already dead. Forensic experts later explained that the positioning of her body could have allowed blood to flow steadily from the deep stab wounds, particularly the severed artery, until the thickening process naturally slowed the bleeding. This could have continued for several hours, suggesting that Janet had been deceased for some time before Raven's arrival. However, given the catastrophic nature of her injuries, forensic specialists could not rule out the possibility that she had been killed just moments before he entered the home. The uncertainty surrounding the exact time of death only added to the growing list of questions detectives needed to answer. When questioned about possible suspects who might have wanted to harm Janet, Raven provided an unexpected and perplexing theory. He suggested that the recent financial difficulties the couple had been facing had taken a severe emotional toll on his wife. In his opinion, Janet had succumbed to the overwhelming burden of their economic struggles and had taken her own life. According to him, she had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her death, often blaming herself for their predicament and expressing distress over their financial instability. However, this claim was immediately met with skepticism and outright rejection by Janet's family and close friends. They insisted that Raven's statements were entirely false, fabricated to mislead investigators. Those closest to Janet knew firsthand how she truly felt. She had confided in them regularly, sharing her frustrations and struggles, but never once had she voiced any inclination toward self-harm. Furthermore, forensic evidence made it abundantly clear that she could not have inflicted these wounds on herself. Compounding the suspicions, evidence at the crime scene suggested that someone else had been in the house at the time of the murder. A bloody shoe print was discovered near Janet's body, along with a fingerprint that did not immediately match hers or Raven's. Strangely, there were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were all intact, leading detectives to one unsettling conclusion. The victim either knew the perpetrator and willingly allowed them into the home, or the attacker already had access to the residence. Either way, this pointed to someone familiar with Janet, someone close enough to enter without resistance. Despite the brutal nature of the attack, there were very few signs of a struggle. The only indication of self-defense was a stab wound to Janet's arm, suggesting she had attempted to shield herself from the fatal blows. This supported the theory that the attack was swift and unexpected. Adding to the mystery, Raven claimed that his wife had already been asleep when he left for his soccer game. If true, this meant that the murderer had likely struck after she had gone to bed, making it even more likely that the killer was someone she trusted enough not to wake up for. Another strange detail stood out to investigators. The only missing items from the house were Raven's laptop and 2 kitchen knives. One of these knives was almost certainly the murder weapon, but the absence of the laptop suggested the possibility that someone wanted to destroy evidence rather than steal valuables. Intriguingly, the perpetrator had ignored other valuable items in the home, including Janet's wedding rings and other jewelry, indicating that robbery was not the motive. At that stage, detectives lacked concrete evidence to arrest anyone, including Raven, so he was temporarily released. However, law enforcement officials had already begun to suspect that he was not as innocent as he claimed. Investigators decided to monitor his actions closely, believing that he might eventually expose himself through his behavior. What followed only deepened their suspicions. Just one day after Janet's murder, Raven packed his belongings, took his infant son Caden, and abruptly left for Utah. On the surface, this move might have been seen as natural. After all, many widowers find it unbearable to remain in the home where their loved one was violently taken from them. Furthermore, given that Raven's family resided in Utah, it made sense that he would seek their support in such a difficult time. However, his behavior upon arriving in Utah raised red flags for both his own relatives and the friends of the deceased. Instead of displaying the grief and devastation one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife in such a horrific manner, Raven appeared indifferent and detached. Witnesses noted that he showed little concern for finding Janet's killer or seeking justice for her murder. Instead, he completely distanced himself from the case, as if he wanted to forget it had ever happened. He ignored calls from investigators and refused to cooperate with authorities. Investigators had stumbled upon a potential motive when they discovered that shortly before the murder, Raven had taken out a significant life insurance policy on Janet's life. The amount? A staggering $600,000. This revelation raised immediate red flags. Given the couple's well-documented financial struggles, it was deeply suspicious that Raven, who often complained about their lack of funds, had somehow managed to consistently pay the policy premiums. Even more alarming was the timeline. Evidence showed that Raven had filed a claim with the insurance company almost immediately after Janet's murder, before her body had even been laid to rest. This brazen move only deepened law enforcement's suspicions. The entire situation reeked of foul play, but it was not yet enough to prove his direct involvement in Janet's death. As detectives delved deeper into Raven's past, they unearthed a web of lies that had surrounded his relationship with Janet from the very beginning. He had presented himself to her as a devout Mormon, claiming to have embarked on a missionary trip to Peru. But it was all fabricated. The stories he had spun to create an illusion of virtue unraveled one by one. Though these deceptions did not directly tie him to the crime, they painted a picture of a man skilled in manipulation and deceit, someone who could craft a compelling narrative to serve his own interests. After Janet's death, Raven relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, where he maintained a low profile. He quietly collected his insurance payout and focused on raising his son, all while seemingly moving forward with his life. But his fresh start did not mean he had abandoned his ways. It was here that he met a woman named Vanessa Pond, a kindergarten teacher who quickly became enamored with the charming single father. Their relationship progressed rapidly, facilitated by the fact that Raven had enrolled son in the school where Vanessa worked. Their frequent encounters turned into something deeper, and before long, they were inseparable. Like Janet before her, Vanessa was drawn to Raven's persistent, charismatic nature. She had spent years raising her child alone and had longed for a partner who would not only love her, but also provide a stable family unit. Raven fit the mold perfectly, at least on the surface. It wasn't long before he began weaving another intricate web of deception. When discussing his past, he told Vanessa that his late wife had tragically died in a car accident. Unbeknownst to Raven, Janet's family was still watching him closely. They had never stopped suspecting him and had made it their mission to track his movements. When they discovered his new relationship, they became even more determined to expose him. To their shock, they found that Raven was continuing his pattern of deception, lying to everyone around him about Janet's fate. He had constructed a false reality in which he was the grieving widower of a tragic accident, rather than the prime suspect in a vicious murder. For a while, Vanessa remained blissfully unaware of the truth. She trusted Raven completely and had no reason to question his version of events. But curiosity has a way of creeping in. Eventually, she began to dig into his past. It didn't take long for her to uncover the chilling truth. Janet had been the victim of a brutal stabbing, and her murder was still an open investigation. Shocked, she confronted Raven. His response was as manipulative as ever. He claimed that he had been unfairly targeted by the police and the public, who were obsessed with pinning the crime on him. He insisted that Janet had been killed during a robbery, and that he had been falsely accused simply because he was her husband. Amazingly, Vanessa believed him. He had an uncanny ability to distort reality, and once again, his lies worked. Despite the evidence staring her in the face, she accepted his explanation, convinced that he was being unfairly persecuted. But Janet's family was determined to intervene. They reached out to Vanessa, warning her that she could be in grave danger. They urged her to reconsider her involvement with Raven, emphasizing the unsettling parallels between her relationship with him and what Janet had endured. Yet Vanessa was too deeply entwined in Raven's web to see the truth. She dismissed the concerns, trusting the man who had charmed his way into her life. Her unwavering faith in him led to their marriage after 3 years of dating. To the outside world, it appeared that Raven had finally moved on and built a new life. But beneath the surface, history was repeating itself. The cracks in their relationship began to show almost immediately. What had once seemed like a fairy tale romance quickly unraveled into a nightmare. Vanessa soon witnessed the same troubling behavior that Janet had endured. Raven's unpredictable mood swings, his bursts of rage, and his controlling tendencies. He began losing control, becoming volatile and aggressive. As the marriage progressed, his behavior worsened. He raised his hand to her in anger, issuing threats that left her terrified for her safety. Fear took root in Vanessa's heart. She had believed she had found love, only to realize she had walked into a dangerous situation. The abuse escalated, and she knew she had to escape. Their marriage, which had once held so much promise, crumbled in just 4 months. She made the difficult decision to leave him, fearing that if she stayed, she might meet the same fate as Janet. Since the pressure from the detectives did not stop, Raven decided to talk to the press. The man publicly expressed hope that the police would eventually solve the case, identify the true perpetrator, and finally stop treating him as a suspect. As media coverage around Raven intensified and more details of Janet's murder emerged, she found herself tormented by an unbearable question. Could her ex-husband have actually murdered his first wife? Vanessa decided to come forward and speak with the media. She confirmed what many had already suspected. Raven Abaroa had always been unstable, manipulative, and prone to fits of aggression. The worst incident, according to Vanessa, occurred on Christmas Eve in 2008. During one of their frequent heated arguments, an argument that he had provoked, Raven suddenly locked her inside the bathroom. Through the locked door, he shouted threats at her, saying he wanted to hit her, that he despised her, and that he wouldn't care if she died. Vanessa's fear was justified. The new detectives working the case felt similarly. They enthusiastically resumed the investigation, determined to piece together the sequence of events that had led to Janet's tragic and brutal death. Everything they examined pointed to one conclusion. Raven was the killer. The primary challenge, however, remained his alibi. Investigators revisited the 911 call he had made upon discovering his wife's body, scrutinizing every word. A major red flag stood out. During the call, Raven claimed that Janet had been shot. This was a glaring mistake. The wounds on her body were clearly stab wounds, and even in a state of shock, it seemed improbable that he wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two. While this wasn't definitive proof of guilt, detectives believed it was an intentional attempt to mislead the investigation. Perhaps he thought that by falsely reporting gunshot wounds, he could create confusion and delay forensic analysis. The police weren't buying his story. They decided to pressure him further. They reached out, asking for a follow-up phone interview. During this call, Raven repeated the same version of events he had told before. However, just like in previous interrogations, he was oddly vague on key details. He struggled to recall significant moments from the night of the murder, an unusual lapse in memory for someone who had gone through such a traumatic event. At one point, he even mocked the police, asserting that they had failed to locate one of the missing knives from his home, which he had later found himself while moving. But the detectives weren't fooled. They knew that their forensic team had conducted an exhaustive examination of the crime scene. If they hadn't found a missing knife, it was because it simply wasn't there. Raven's story reeked of manipulation. Over the years, as the case continued to stall, the new team of investigators struggled to reconstruct the original crime scene and timeline with absolute certainty. As part of their renewed efforts, detectives began reaching out to Raven's past girlfriends, hoping to uncover more about his character. Their findings were both disturbing and eerily consistent. Every woman they spoke to painted a chillingly similar picture. Raven was controlling, volatile, and prone to violent outbursts. Many of them admitted that his aggressive tendencies had been the primary reason for the end of their relationships. These testimonies further strengthened the case against him. Another peculiar detail emerged, something seemingly small but potentially significant. Before leaving for his soccer game on the night of the murder, Raven had locked his dog inside the garage. This was highly unusual. He had never done this before. When asked about it, he provided no logical explanation. However, detectives suspected they knew the real reason. A dog is naturally protective of its home and owner. If an intruder had attacked Janet, the dog would have likely reacted, barking loudly and possibly even attacking the perpetrator. Investigators also uncovered a suspicious action taken by the suspect the day before the crime. Raven had transferred data from his laptop onto another storage device. This raised serious red flags. It seemed more like an act of deliberate preparation rather than a coincidence, particularly since the laptop was reported stolen soon after. This discovery added to the mounting pile of circumstantial evidence. Based on these developments, on February 1, 2010, Raven Abaroa was officially arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. He was extradited to North Carolina to face trial, but despite the growing suspicion against him, the case remained largely circumstantial. Investigators knew they needed more concrete evidence to secure a conviction, so they meticulously continued combing through crime scene photos and forensic reports. During this renewed scrutiny, a detective made an important observation. In one of the crime scene photographs, an empty contact lens case was visible on the bedside table. This seemingly insignificant detail took on great importance when Janet's parents insisted that their daughter never slept with her lenses in. She always removed them before going to bed. However, Raven had repeatedly told investigators that when he left for his soccer game that night, Janet was already in bed, asleep with their baby. This discrepancy raised a crucial question. Could Janet have been murdered before ever going to bed, contradicting Raven's timeline entirely? Unfortunately, during the initial autopsy, the medical examiner had not checked whether Janet had been wearing her contact lenses at the time of her death. Determined to find the truth, Janet's grieving family supported an exhumation of her body to confirm this theory. In July 2010, forensic experts exhumed Janet's remains. Despite decomposition, they found what appeared to be the remnants of contact lenses on her eyes. Though the material had dried out and deformed over time, advanced forensic techniques allowed them to confirm that the lenses had indeed been in place when she died. To ensure that this discovery would hold weight in court, experts conducted a large-scale experiment that took nearly a year. Using pig's eyes, similar in structure to human eyes, Scientists inserted contact lenses and subjected them to an embalming process identical to what human bodies go through before burial. The results were conclusive. Contact lenses remained intact and detectable even after extended decomposition. This experiment definitively proved that Janet had been murdered while still wearing her lenses, reinforcing the theory that she was attacked before bedtime. Raven's claim that she had been asleep when he left was now irrefutably proven false, further implicating him in the crime. By the time the trial began in 2013, the case had garnered widespread public attention. The prosecution laid out a compelling case against Raven, making it clear that they firmly believed he was guilty of murdering his wife. However, the biggest challenge for the prosecution remained the lack of direct evidence. Everything pointed to Raven, but there was no smoking gun. The defense capitalized on this fact, arguing that all the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no definitive proof linking Raven to the murder. During the investigation, yet another damning piece of evidence emerged, one that further exposed Raven's deception. Throughout the police interrogations, he had repeatedly claimed that he found his wife already dead upon his arrival home. But investigators learned that he had made a shocking confession during a conversation at a local church. In that confession, Raven admitted that Janet had still been alive when he found her. He claimed that she had even attempted to speak before collapsing and dying in front of him. As the case unfolded, detectives explored another potential motive. Was Janet planning to leave her husband? Investigators discovered that in the weeks leading up to her death, Janet had been in contact with an old boyfriend, a man named Scott. Some speculated that she might have been rekindling a romantic relationship, but upon examining their exchanges, detectives found no clear evidence of an affair. Instead, their messages suggested that she had only just begun reaching out, possibly seeking emotional support rather than intimacy. Another crucial argument presented by the prosecution was centered around a possible motive for the crime: Janet's unplanned pregnancy. According to investigators, Janet had only shared this news with a select few, including several of her sisters. Those close to her confirmed that she was elated at the thought of becoming a mother again, but at the same time, she harbored doubts about Raven's ability to be a responsible father. Given their already dire financial situation, prosecutors suggested that the pregnancy might have been the breaking point for Raven. The possibility of another child could have exacerbated their economic struggles, fueling tensions within the marriage. This, the prosecution argued, might have pushed Raven to commit the ultimate crime, eliminating Janet rather than facing the challenges of another child. As new revelations continued to surface, the defense filed a motion to have the trial delayed, arguing that the character portrayals of both the victim and the defendant had not been fully explored. The court granted the motion, rescheduling the next phase of the trial for March 2014. By this time, however, a dramatic turn of events had occurred. Raven Abaroa, likely realizing that the mounting evidence against him was too substantial to fight, agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution. Under the terms of the deal, Raven was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 8 years. In the heart of America, a small town became the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. A woman vanished without a trace, leaving behind a series of unanswered questions that would soon lead to horrific revelations. Evidence pointed to a remote location, where what was found among the ashes and debris painted a picture too terrible to comprehend. Forensic examination revealed signs of violence so chilling that investigators struggled to piece together the full horror of what had occurred. As the investigation unfolded, questions about sexual assault or brutality continued to haunt the case. This was more than just a murder. It was a crime that would forever scar the community. Teresa Halbach was born on March 22, 1980, in Kaukauna, Wisconsin, USA. Teresa always had a dream of starting her own studio, where she could fully express her artistic vision. After saving up enough to get started, she decided to take the leap and launch her business. Unfortunately, things didn't go as smoothly as she had hoped. The income from her photography work was inconsistent, and she struggled to cover her expenses. Eventually, Teresa made the difficult decision to move back in with her parents to save money. However, she never abandoned her dream, using this challenging period as motivation to work even harder. During this time, Teresa took on various assignments to keep her photography business afloat. She began photographing used cars for magazines, a job that required her to travel frequently. To support her work, She purchased a used car. While the job was not glamorous, Teresa approached it with professionalism and pride, believing it was a stepping stone to something greater. One of her recurring assignments involved photographing vehicles at a sprawling junkyard in Gibson, Wisconsin. The business, owned by the Avery family, was home to roughly 4,000 used cars scattered across hundreds of acres. The property also featured several outbuildings, including a garage, a barn, and a mobile trailer where Stephen Avery, one of the owners, lived. Stephen's brothers, who also had troubled pasts, helped manage the salvage yard. The Avery family was well known in the area, with even the road leading to their property named after them. Stephen Avery's history was as complex as it was controversial. From the age of 18, Stephen had frequent run-ins with the law. He was involved in multiple incidents, including burglaries and acts of cruelty to animals. One particularly horrific episode involved dousing a cat in gasoline and setting it on fire, a crime that deeply disturbed the community. For this, he served a short prison sentence, but his criminal behavior escalated over time. In January 1985, Stephen Avery found himself at the center of a harrowing confrontation when he assaulted a female law enforcement officer. During the altercation, he brandished a gun, threatening her life. The situation escalated to the point where Stephen only decided to retreat upon noticing the presence of the officer's young daughter in the back seat of her car. This grave offense led to Stephen being sentenced to 6 years in prison. However, his troubles were far from over. While out on bail awaiting his trial, Stephen was implicated in another serious crime: the brutal assault of Penny Bernston, a jogger in a nearby town. Despite possessing a solid alibi supported by receipts and multiple witnesses, Stephen was convicted of attempted murder, rape, and false imprisonment, primarily based on the victim's testimony. Stephen's conviction ignited a significant controversy, as a considerable number of people staunchly believed in his innocence. The forensic evidence gathered at the crime scene did not align with Stephen's profile, yet the limited technological capabilities of the 1980 hindered a thorough examination of this inconsistency. The resultant 32-year sentence was a devastating blow to Stephen, but he remained resolute in his declaration of innocence. Over the ensuing years, he pursued numerous appeals, all of which were systematically denied, deepening the sense of injustice surrounding his case. In 1996, a beacon of hope emerged when the organization dedicated to exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals took an interest in Stephen's plight. With their expertise and support, Stephen's case was reopened. Breakthroughs in DNA technology provided the necessary tools to uncover the truth. The forensic advancements made it possible to reevaluate the evidence with a level of precision previously unattainable, ultimately revealing the critical discrepancies that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. The turning point came when the police database identified a match with Gregory Allen, a man already serving a 60-year sentence for assault and rape. Gregory Allen resided in the same region as Stephen Avery, and the two men shared a striking physical resemblance, a factor that had significantly contributed to Stephen's wrongful conviction. This judicial error, resulting in Stephen being wrongfully imprisoned for 18 years, highlighted profound flaws within the legal system, particularly concerning eyewitness identification and forensic analysis during that era. On September 10, 2003, the court officially acknowledged Stephen's innocence and released him from prison. By this time, the years of incarceration had irreparably altered his life. His wife had divorced him, taking their children with her, leaving Stephen to grapple with the remnants of a life that had been upended by a miscarriage of justice. Following his release, Stephen took legal action by filing a $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County, holding them accountable for his wrongful imprisonment. This lawsuit stirred considerable debate, raising critical questions about the accountability of law enforcement and the systemic issues that allow such injustices to occur. Amidst the turmoil of Stephen Avery's life, Teresa Halbach emerged as a pivotal figure in the unfolding narrative. Teresa, a compassionate and optimistic 25-year-old photographer, was acutely aware of Stephen's ordeal and the errors that had devastated his life. Her professional relationship with Stephen had been built over multiple photography assignments, often involving visits to the Avery salvage yard. Teresa's belief in fairness and her trust in Stephen were evident through the rapport they had developed over time, showcasing her commitment to her work and her integrity as a photographer. On October 31, 2005, Teresa's day was meticulously planned with a series of appointments. Residing in Hilbert, Wisconsin, she departed her home early that morning in her blue 1999 Toyota RAV4 to fulfill her scheduled tasks. Her first stop was near Lake Michigan in Gibson, Wisconsin, approximately 50 kilometers from her home. There, she was tasked with photographing a minivan for Stephen Avery, who intended to sell it through the magazine she collaborated with. This visit to the Avery salvage yard was not unusual for Teresa, as her job frequently brought her to the expansive lot teeming with various vehicles. She had 2 additional appointments lined up for that day, indicating a busy schedule that underscored her dedication to her profession. However, after leaving the salvage yard, Teresa mysteriously vanished. Her absence became increasingly alarming when she failed to return home as expected. On November 3, 2005, 3 days after Teresa's disappearance, her mother, Teresa Halbach, grew deeply concerned and contacted the sheriff's department to report her missing. Karen described Teresa's unusual silence, noting that it was uncharacteristic for her to be out of touch for such an extended period. As a young entrepreneur striving to expand her business, Teresa was known for her diligence and commitment to maintaining regular communication with her clients. Her sudden and unexplained absence was both out of character and profoundly worrying. Karen also reached out to Stephen Avery to ask about her daughter's whereabouts. Stephen claimed he had no knowledge of where Teresa might be. With no immediate answers, Karen turned to the police for help. News of Teresa's disappearance quickly spread, with television broadcasts and flyers distributed throughout the community. Her family worked tirelessly to disseminate information about Teresa and her car, a key piece of evidence that could potentially lead to her location. Detectives quickly determined that Teresa never made it to her other appointments on October 31, raising suspicion that something had happened during her visit to the Avery property. The police decided to investigate the salvage yard, and on November 5th, officers arrived at the scene. Earl Avery, one of Stephen's brothers, granted them permission to search the premises. The search was extensive, covering dozens of vehicles across the sprawling lot. In a remote section of the property, officers discovered a blue Toyota hidden under tree branches and debris. The car, locked and missing its license plates, appeared to have been deliberately concealed. Upon inspection, authorities confirmed it was Teresa Halbach's vehicle. The discovery marked a turning point in the case. The Toyota was seized and sent to a forensic lab for examination. The investigation then turned to Stephen Avery's trailer. In Stephen's bedroom, police discovered a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle mounted on the wall, along with a powder charging device. Further searches of the garage yielded 11 spent casings that matched the rifle. On the 3rd day of the search, investigators found the key to Teresa's car inside Stephen's trailer, a discovery that raised questions about how it had been overlooked during earlier searches. The evidence against Stephen continued to mount. The findings implicated Stephen Avery in Teresa's disappearance, launching a complex and controversial investigation that would captivate the nation. The circumstances surrounding the evidence in Teresa Halbach's murder case stirred widespread skepticism and controversy. Critics found it suspicious that Teresa's car key was discovered only after multiple searches of Stephen Avery's home, and questioned why critical evidence surfaced seemingly in tandem with heavy police involvement. These concerns fueled allegations of potential misconduct and suggested the possibility of evidence tampering. The case quickly escalated from a tragic investigation into a divisive public debate, drawing attention to broader issues of justice, corruption, and the reliability of the legal system. For Teresa Halbach's family, the investigation brought an agonizing mix of emotions. The discovery of her vehicle and personal items offered hope of resolution, but also deepened the dread of uncovering the horrific truth. As law enforcement zeroed in on Avery's salvage yard, the Halbachs and the community anxiously awaited answers about what had transpired on Halloween Day, an ordinary event that had turned into a nightmare. On November 8, 2005, a breakthrough occurred when Teresa's license plates were found in a scrap metal pile at the Avery salvage yard. The plates were severely crumpled, as if someone had deliberately damaged them to avoid identification. Investigators speculated that the perpetrator intended to dispose of the plates permanently, but failed to do so before they were found. This discovery alone raised further suspicions, but it was not the most shocking find that day. Nearby, a metal garbage barrel revealed burned clothing resembling the outfit Teresa was last seen wearing. Intermingled with the charred remains were fragments of a camera, a mobile phone, and other personal belongings, as well as a partially melted shovel. The barrel's contents indicated a calculated attempt to destroy evidence. Elsewhere on the property, forensic teams made a grim discovery: bone and tooth fragments in the remnants of a large bonfire. Experts confirmed the remains belonged to a woman between 25 and 30 years old, consistent with Teresa's age. Forensic analysis suggested her body had been mutilated and incinerated, possibly to obliterate any trace of her. The investigation further implicated Stephen Avery when forensic experts found traces of his DNA in Teresa's Toyota. Hair strands, sweat, skin particles, and blood matched to Stephen were identified throughout the vehicle. Teresa's blood was also found, particularly in the trunk, suggesting she had been transported after sustaining fatal injuries. This mounting evidence prompted authorities to reclassify Teresa's disappearance as a homicide and led to Stephen Avery's formal interrogation. During questioning, Avery denied involvement in Teresa's death. He admitted she had visited his salvage yard on October 31, 2005, around 2 p.m., for a pre-scheduled appointment to photograph a vehicle he intended to sell. Avery claimed Teresa left shortly after completing her work, taking $40 in cash and leaving a sample magazine. He stated he had no knowledge of her whereabouts after that, insisting he had never entered her car or harmed her in any way. Despite his assertions, the physical evidence overwhelmingly pointed to the salvage yard as the scene of a violent crime. On November 9th, Stephen Avery was arrested, initially on charges of illegal possession of firearms. As the investigation continued, authorities prepared to add more serious charges. The case captured national media attention, fueled by Avery's pending $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County for a previous wrongful conviction. Journalists swarmed the salvage yard, eager to uncover every detail of the sensational case. Stephen Avery seized the opportunity to address the public, vehemently proclaiming his innocence. He alleged that the police had framed him to discredit his lawsuit and ensure his conviction. Avery argued that the discovery of key evidence, including the crumpled license plates and the DNA in Teresa's car, was too convenient, accusing law enforcement of planting incriminating items to fabricate a case against him. His claims resonated with some who questioned the integrity of the investigation, particularly given the controversial history between Avery and the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. In interviews, Stephen did not dispute that a terrible crime might have occurred on his property, but argued that the salvage yard was not secure. He explained that anyone with knowledge of the lot could have accessed it, committed a crime, and used the vast space to dispose of evidence without his involvement. His brothers echoed these sentiments, pointing out that the sprawling salvage yard was far too open to monitor consistently. Nonetheless, on November 15, 2005, Stephen was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide. At his preliminary hearing, the court set his bail at $500,000. Stephen's defense team, supported by activists and members of the public, argued that the charges were part of a calculated effort to discredit him and sabotage his lawsuit. They pointed to the logistical improbability of the prosecution's claims, emphasizing that acquiring Stephen's DNA without his knowledge would have been virtually impossible. The prosecution countered by detailing the extensive forensic evidence tying Stephen to the crime, painting a picture of deliberate and premeditated violence. The case sparked a surge of public outcry. The Innocence Project, which had previously championed Stephen's exoneration, was inundated with calls and messages from supporters who believed he was once again a victim of systemic injustice. For Stephen Avery, the mounting evidence and public scrutiny painted him as either a calculating killer or a wrongfully accused man caught in an unrelenting system. For Teresa Halbach's family, the search for justice was overshadowed by the sensationalism of the case, leaving them to grieve in the face of an ever-growing media circus. Many viewed Stephen as a symbol of corruption in law enforcement and rallied for his release. Meanwhile, detectives pressed forward, determined to uncover the full story behind Teresa's death. Despite the abundance of evidence, investigators struggled to piece together the exact sequence of events. Questions about how and why the crime occurred lingered. To fill in the gaps, detectives turned to Stephen's family, friends, and acquaintances. One of the key witnesses was Stephen's 17-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, whose involvement in the case would add another layer of complexity and controversy. Brendan was a quiet and reserved teenager who lived nearby with his mother. When detectives approached him, They claimed to be seeking clarity about events at the salvage yard on the day of Teresa's disappearance. Initially, Brendan denied knowing anything about the crime. However, after hours of questioning without legal counsel or parental presence, Brendan's statements constantly began to shift. Detectives claimed Brendan had provided unimportant details linking him and Stephen to Teresa's murder, which were inconsistent and raised concerns of deception. On February 27, 2006, the Brendan was called in for reinterrogation, as investigators believed that the young man was withholding too much. This time, the high school student admitted that, together with his uncle, he participated in the sexually abused, torture, and murder of Teresa. According to the teenager's confession, on October 31, he returned from school around 3:45 p.m. Brendan lived near his uncle's trailer and found a letter for him when he checked the mailbox. When the young man approached trailer to hand over the envelope, he heard a female voice from inside asking for help. Next to the trailer was a metal barrel in which a fire was burning. The teenager noticed that, in the flames, there was a melted mobile phone and a camera. All this was covered with women's clothing, which had almost completely burned out. Brendan waited quite a long time for an answer from his uncle. Finally, Stephen opened the door for him. The man invited his nephew into the kitchen and then offered to take advantage of his captive. Inside the bedroom, the schoolboy saw a naked Teresa who was chained to the bed with handcuffs and shackles. Stephen said that he had already sexually abused the woman several times and was going to continue doing so. She asked Brendan to persuade his uncle to let her go, but instead, the teenager sexually abused Teresa. According to the young man's confession, Stephen watched the process. After that, they watched TV for about 10 to 15 minutes. The uncle praised the boy. Next, they discussed the murder and how to get rid of the body. Having agreed on a plan of action, the criminals took up knives. Stephen stabbed the victim in the stomach and ordered his nephew to cut her throat. The high school student obeyed. Then they cut off several strands of hair from the deceased. The uncle strangled the woman with her throat cut in front of his nephew. This lasted several minutes. The man explained to the boy that he wanted to ensure Teresa was truly dead, though it was already evident. This statement suggested that Stephen may have derived some satisfaction from the process of inflicting harm. After confirming her death, they moved the body from the trunk of Teresa's car into the garage. There, Stephen unleashed further brutality, shooting her approximately 10 times. 4 of these bullets struck her head, while the remainder riddled her torso and limbs. The violence continued with a calculated attempt to erase any trace of their gruesome actions. Stephen and Brendan then carried Teresa's lifeless body to an already roaring fire on the property. To fuel the flames and ensure complete destruction, they added several tires, creating a black, acrid smoke that would hide their monstrous deeds. Once the fire reached its peak, the killers moved Teresa's car, camouflaging it with branches and debris. They then worked to eliminate evidence inside the garage, scrubbing bloodstains with gasoline and solvent in a desperate attempt to erase their crime. Stephen later disposed of Teresa's license plates and retained her car keys, furthering the cover-up. After the body had burned extensively, the remaining charred bones were broken apart with a shovel. Stephen and Brendan transported these remains to a secondary location under the cover of darkness. Brendan, disoriented and unsure of specifics, later claimed he couldn't remember precisely where they had buried the bones. Despite this uncertainty, authorities eventually discovered a burial site containing Teresa's fragmented, burnt bones on the salvage yard property. When Brendan's relatives were questioned, they expressed skepticism about the veracity of his story. They described him as a boy with significant developmental delays and a low IQ, someone who required constant direction and struggled with independence. According to them, Brendan had a history of fabricating strange tales, which he often presented as fact. His family doubted his capacity to carry out the crimes he described or to participate to the extent he claimed. Their disbelief was compounded by Brendan's documented tendency to exaggerate or invent scenarios, leading them to dismiss his confession as another product of his imagination. However, physical evidence unearthed during the investigation supported key details of Brendan's story, casting doubt on the notion that it was entirely fabricated. Charred human remains, Teresa's belongings, and forensic analysis of the crime scenes aligned disturbingly well with his narrative, painting a murky intersection of crime, manipulation, and justice. While Brendan's cognitive limitations and his family's doubts raised questions about his culpability and the reliability of his statements, the corroborating physical evidence painted a damning portrait. The case also highlighted systemic issues surrounding the interrogation of vulnerable individuals, sparking debates about the ethics and reliability of confessions obtained under duress. On June 30th, 2006, Brendan wrote a letter to the county judge. In the letter, he admitted to feeling the urge to communicate earlier but claimed he lacked access to a pen or pencil. In this correspondence, Brendan recanted his confession, asserting that on October 31, 2005, he and his uncle spent the day riding a golf cart around the salvage yard, collecting garbage for burning. This sudden retraction added another layer of complexity to an already convoluted case, prompting further scrutiny of the methods used to extract Brendan's original confession. Brendan and Stephen vehemently denied committing any acts of murder or sexual assault. However, Brendan's letter and subsequent recantation of his confession were met with skepticism by the authorities, as many of his initial statements aligned with physical evidence. The judicial proceedings against both men moved forward. Brendan's trial was scheduled for April 2007, with the possibility of a life sentence plus an additional 72 years if convicted. Stephen Avery's trial was set for February 5, 2007. He faced multiple charges, including first-degree intentional homicide, sexual assault, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, mutilation of a corpse, and illegal possession of firearms. A conviction on all counts would ensure a life sentence without parole. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on forensic evidence and Brendan's initial testimony, even though he later retracted it. The forensic analysis of the victim's remains was a centerpiece of the trial. The bones and teeth recovered from the burn site were in poor condition, fragmented, and charred. Forensic experts identified several gunshot wounds in Teresa's skull fragments, but it could not be conclusively determined whether these wounds were inflicted before or after her death. In addition, evidence collected from the garage on Stephen Avery's property supported Brendan's original statements. A bullet bearing Teresa's DNA, traces of her blood, burned remnants of her phone and camera, and her car keys were all discovered during the investigation. However, the defense countered by presenting an alternative narrative. They argued that Stephen Avery was framed by law enforcement officials seeking to avoid a $36 million payout stemming from Stephen's wrongful conviction in a prior rape case. The defense highlighted suspicious evidence, including the disappearance of a vial of Stephen's blood from the evidence room in his earlier case, suggesting it may have been used to plant incriminating bloodstains at the crime scene. This theory sought to cast doubt on the integrity of the investigation, painting it as a calculated conspiracy against Stephen. Brendan's trial began on April 16, 2007, with the 17-year-old facing 3 major charges: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and first-degree sexual assault with aggravating circumstances. His defense team argued that Brendan's intellectual limitations and low IQ made him vulnerable to coercion by the police. They posited that his confession was not a truthful account of events, but rather a narrative shaped by suggestive questioning and pressure to implicate himself and his uncle. Despite Brendan's retraction of his initial confession, the prosecution presented a compelling case. Video recordings of his interrogations and confessions were shown to the jury, including footage in which he described his involvement in Teresa's assault and murder. In one particularly damning clip, Brendan stated that his motivation to participate stemmed from curiosity about sex, and that he later regretted not stopping his uncle. This video, paired with physical evidence and Brendan's apparent lack of motive to fabricate the story, bolstered the prosecution's argument. The defense worked diligently to discredit the confession, calling attention to the absence of Teresa's DNA, hair, or blood on Brendan's clothing. They argued that the lack of physical evidence directly tying Brendan to the crime indicated that his confession was unreliable. However, the prosecution countered this by pointing out that solvent stains on Brendan's clothing suggested he had participated in cleaning up evidence in the garage. Solvent, they noted, is known to destroy biological traces like blood, which explained the absence of incriminating material on Brendan's attire. Brendan's sister, Kayla, was called to testify. During earlier police interviews, she claimed that Brendan had shared specific details of Teresa's murder with her. However, in court, Kayla recanted her statements, creating tension in the prosecution's case. Despite this, the prosecution maintained that Brendan's initial confession was truthful. Detectives testified that their goal during Brendan's interrogations was to expose him in any lies, not to manipulate him into a false confession. They insisted that the confession was voluntary and corroborated by evidence, despite the defense's claims of coercion. Adding another layer of complexity, the defense introduced expert witnesses who highlighted Brendan's cognitive impairments, emphasizing that his intellectual limitations made him more likely to agree with authority figures or fabricate stories to please them. They argued that Brendan's desire to appease the detectives may have led him to confess to events that he did not fully understand or participate in. The trials of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey became a focal point of public and legal scrutiny, sparking debates about police practices, the reliability of confessions, and the potential for systemic corruption. Brendan's case, in particular, underscored the challenges faced by intellectually disabled defendants in navigating the criminal justice system. The video evidence, conflicting testimonies, and the specter of a potential frame-up by law enforcement made the case one of the most contentious and polarizing in recent memory. These recordings, combined with physical evidence discovered on Stephen Avery's property, provided a damning narrative that supported the prosecution's case. Brendan, however, later recanted his confession after he was imprisoned, seemingly realizing the gravity of the situation he was facing. Brendan's defense team believed that his testimony could sway the jury and allowed him to appear in court. The defense claimed Brendan initially viewed the interrogations as a game and did not grasp the serious implications of his words. Brendan himself admitted that he could not explain why he invented certain parts of his confession, suggesting that some details were drawn from books he had read. However, the prosecution pointed out that key elements of his story aligned closely with forensic evidence found at the crime scene, undercutting the defense's assertions of fabrication. On April 26, 2007, the jury deliberated for 4.5 hours before reaching a verdict. Brendan was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and sexual assault. As the verdict was announced, Brendan's mother left the courthouse, visibly upset. When reporters pursued her, she refused to comment, but later shouted from her vehicle that she believed Teresa Halbach's family had colluded with the police to orchestrate a frame-up. Meanwhile, Stephen Avery awaited sentencing in a county jail, housed one floor below his uncle Stephen Avery's cell. He reportedly feared his uncle and spoke openly about his struggles with anxiety, depression, and sleeplessness as a result of the case. Once an avid reader, Brendan claimed he could no longer concentrate enough to pick up a book. On August 2, 2007, Brendan returned to court for new sentencing. The judge ruled that he would be eligible for parole, but only after serving 41 years of his life sentence. During closing arguments, prosecutors contended that Brendan had knowingly chosen to participate in evil acts. They argued that he understood the difference between right and wrong, but consciously decided to join in the assault and murder of Teresa Halbach out of a twisted sense of curiosity. Teresa's family also addressed the court, expressing their anger and heartbreak. They accused Brendan of failing to intervene or persuade his uncle to spare Teresa's life, an act they believed he was capable of but chose not to attempt. After a short time, in a dramatic turn of events, a federal judge overturned Brendan's conviction, ruling that his confession had been obtained under duress. The judge cited concerns about the techniques used by investigators during Brendan's interrogations, given his intellectual limitations. However, in June 2017, the prosecutor's office appealed this decision, and 8 months later, a panel of 7 appellate judges narrowly voted 4-3 to reinstate Brendan's original conviction. They concluded that the police had acted appropriately during the interrogations and that the confession was valid. Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey have continued to file appeals, steadfastly maintaining their innocence. The toll of imprisonment on Brendan has been severe. He has openly discussed his fears of being targeted by other inmates and his struggles with depression. In a poignant admission, he described crying himself to sleep every night, overwhelmed by despair and the weight of his situation. Stephen Avery, meanwhile, settled his $36 million lawsuit against Manitowoc County for his prior wrongful conviction, receiving a payout of $400,000. However, Stephen's character has remained a subject of controversy. His former fiancée, Jody Stokowski, came forward to describe him as a violent and controlling man who had threatened her life. She alleged that Stephen's wrongful imprisonment for a previous crime fueled his anger towards women and a desire for revenge. Letters written by Stephen from prison reportedly contained additional threats against her and her family. Discussion of the case materials Stephen Avery took about 20 hours. On March 18, 2007, The jury found Stephen guilty of intentional murder and illegal possession of a firearm. All the lawyer's arguments were found unconvincing. The defendant was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. The case of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey continues to polarize public opinion. While many believe the overwhelming evidence points to their guilt, others remain convinced that they were victims of a corrupt system intent on framing them. The conflicting narratives, the questionable methods used during Brendan's interrogations, and the broader context of Stephen's prior wrongful conviction have fueled ongoing debates about justice and accountability.